In 1947, as France struggled to reassert colonial control over Indochina, Air France attempted to maintain a fragile passenger link between Paris and Saigon. The route stretched over 11,000 kilometers, required no fewer than 7 refueling stops across North Africa, the Middle East, and the Indian subcontinent, and consumed nearly 4 full days of travel. Aircraft were unpressurized, and monsoon diversions were frequent enough that pilots carried survival kits for jungle landings. The service existed not because it was commercially viable, but because empire demanded it. For decades after, Vietnamese aviation remained an afterthought, a single-state carrier, limited domestic routes, and an airspace shaped more by conflict than commerce. Southeast Asian aviation belonged to Bangkok, Singapore, and Kuala Lumpur. Vietnam was a destination you flew to on someone else's airline. Then, between roughly 2011 and 2025, Vietnam went from operating 2 airlines to 6. A single privately owned carrier, Vietjet, placed orders for 300 aircraft from Airbus alone. The country's domestic air travel now rivals Thailand's. In 2025, Vietnamese airports handled a record 83.5 million passengers, up 10.7% year-on-year, with 113 international routes spanning Northeast Asia, Europe, and Oceania. But here's what makes no sense. Vietnam's per capita GDP sits around $4,300. Its airports are operating beyond designed capacity. The country's third largest airline nearly collapsed after its founder was imprisoned for fraud. Yet, Boeing identifies Vietnam as Southeast Asia's fastest-growing aviation market through 2030. IATA ranks it 5th globally for projected growth. Foreign carriers like AirAsia have spent 2 decades trying and failing to gain a foothold. So, how did a country with a crumbling airport infrastructure and a single-state airline just 15 years ago quietly build the most dynamic aviation market in Southeast Asia? To understand why Vietnam's aviation explosion was almost inevitable, you need to understand the country's unique physical constraint. Vietnam stretches approximately 1,650 kilometers from north to south, but averages only 50 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. The 2 economic centers, Hanoi in the north and Ho Chi Minh City in the south, sit roughly 1,000 kilometers apart. The geography is functionally a corridor. For most of Vietnam's modern history, connecting these 2 cities meant enduring a grueling 30-hour train ride on the Reunification Express, or an even longer bus ride through winding mountain highways. The road and rail infrastructure, much of it dating to French colonial construction and devastated by decades of war, simply could not keep pace with a rapidly urbanizing population. This wasn't like Thailand, where Bangkok serves as a centralized hub, and domestic flights supplement an extensive highway network. Vietnam's population is fundamentally bifurcated. Nearly 100 million people are distributed between 2 distant poles, with major secondary cities like Da Nang, Nha Trang, and Phu Quoc spread along that narrow coastal corridor. Ground transportation between them wasn't just slow, it was economically wasteful. The Hanoi to Ho Chi Minh City route became one of the busiest domestic air travel corridors on Earth. In 2025, it ranked as the 4th busiest domestic route globally, providing nearly 11 million seats. According to AOG, airlines weren't competing with each other as much as they were competing with the train, the bus, and the motorcycle, and they were winning decisively. The constraint was permanent. Vietnam couldn't build a high-speed rail network overnight. The mountain's central spine made highway expansion prohibitively expensive. Aviation wasn't a luxury for Vietnam, it was the only viable mass transportation option for a rapidly modernizing economy. Then, in 2011, everything changed. Vietjet Air, founded in 2007 by Nguyen Thi Phuong Thao as Vietnam's first privately owned airline, launched its inaugural commercial flight from Ho Chi Minh City to Hanoi. The timing was deliberate. Vietnam's middle class was expanding rapidly, with over 40% of the population aged between 25 and 59, precisely the demographic most likely to fly for business or family visits. Vietjet introduced something Vietnam had never experienced: genuinely affordable air travel. Promotional fares dropped to a few dollars. Flights that previously cost a month's wages for an average worker suddenly competed with bus tickets. The effect was immediate and transformative. Millions of Vietnamese became first-time flyers. Vietjet's model was ruthlessly efficient: high seating density, rapid aircraft turnarounds, aggressive promotional pricing that generated enormous media coverage. Sometimes controversially, the publicity machine worked. By 2017, Vietjet held its IPO, and Thao became Southeast Asia's first self-made female billionaire. The numbers that followed were staggering. Vietjet ordered 200 Boeing 737 MAX aircraft in deals signed during state visits by US Presidents Barack Obama and Donald Trump. At the 2025 Paris Air Show, Vietjet signed for 100 additional Airbus A321neo jets, plus 50 purchase options. The largest order at the event firmed in October 2025. The airline also ordered a total of 40 Airbus A330-900neo widebodies. Vietjet now has 134 aircraft. But Vietjet wasn't operating in a vacuum. Vietnam Airlines, the state-owned flag carrier, responded with its own modernization. The airline operates a fleet of 102 aircraft, including Airbus narrowbodies and A350-900s, 17 Boeing 787s, and 6 ATR-72 regional turboprops. In 2024, Vietnam Airlines posted the highest profit in its history: 8 trillion VND, roughly $310 million, and total revenue of $4.4 billion. That ended 4 consecutive years of losses. Between these two carriers emerged Bamboo Airways in 2019, Viet Travel Airlines, Pacific Airlines under Vietnam Airlines subsidiary structure, and regional operator Vasco. In 2025, Sun Phu Quoc Airways began flights, becoming yet another Vietnamese airline. Sun Phu Quoc Airways also placed orders for up to 40 787s. But here's where the surface narrative misleads. 7 Airlines suggests a competitive free market. The reality is something closer to a carefully balanced duopoly. The attempted challengers tell a cautionary story. Bamboo Airways launched with extraordinary ambition, planning a fleet of 100 aircraft by 2028, including Boeing 787 widebodies for intercontinental routes. Then, in March 2022, its founder, Trinh Van Quay, was arrested for stock market manipulation and fraudulent appropriation of assets, eventually sentenced to prison. The airline imploded. It returned 19 aircraft to lessors, including its entire widebody fleet, fired its foreign pilots, cut 60% of its payroll, and accumulated losses exceeding 2.3 trillion VND. By late 2025, Bamboo operated just 7 aircraft on 12 domestic routes. Foreign entry proved equally difficult. AirAsia, Southeast Asia's largest low-cost carrier, attempted to establish a Vietnamese joint venture several times over 2 decades, partnering with Pacific Airlines in 2005, Vinishin in 2007, Vietjet in 2010, and Hyle Aviation in a venture announced in 2017 and abandoned in 2019. Every attempt failed. Vietnamese regulations cap foreign ownership in air transportation at 30%, creating a near impenetrable barrier. Tony Fernandez, AirAsia's CEO, publicly acknowledged his frustration. The duopoly isn't accidental, it's structural. But here's where this entire story takes a big unexpected turn. The significance of Vietnam's aviation boom, it isn't really about Vietjet's order book, and it isn't about Vietnam Airlines' record profits. It's about what happens when passenger demand systematically outgrows the infrastructure designed to contain it, and how that mismatch is quietly reshaping competitive dynamics across all of Southeast Asia. Vietnam operates 22 airports with a combined designed capacity of approximately 96 million passengers annually. In 2025, those airports handled 83.5 million passengers, with projections targeting 95 million in 2026. The system is approaching and, in some cases, already exceeding its physical limits. Tan Son Nhat International Airport in Ho Chi Minh City is the most extreme example. During the 5-day liberation holiday period alone, the airport processed roughly 710,000 passengers. The terminal infrastructure was not designed for this volume. Delays cascade, taxiway congestion compounds, gate availability becomes a strategic bottleneck. This is where the 5.45 billion Long Tan International Airport enters the equation. Slated to begin operations in mid-2026 in Dong Nai Province, Long Tan represents the single largest aviation infrastructure investment in Vietnamese history. It's designed to eventually handle 100 million passengers annually, effectively doubling southern Vietnam's airport capacity. The broader national plan requires approximately $19 billion to develop 33 airports by 2030. You see, Vietnam isn't just building an airline market, it's building the physical ecosystem to support one. Every other Southeast Asian aviation hub, Bangkok's Suvarnabhumi, Singapore's Changi, and Kuala Lumpur International Airport, was built infrastructure first. Vietnam is doing it backwards. The demand arrived before the terminals. The aircraft orders were placed before the runways existed to park them, and somehow the system keeps growing. Yet, growth is colliding with a crisis that threatens to cap Vietnam's trajectory. The Pratt & Whitney PW1000G engine recall, triggered by a manufacturing defect in powder metal components, has grounded commercial aircraft in Vietnam. The consequences are severe. Maintenance inspection times ballooned from 60 days to over 300 days as global repair facilities became overwhelmed. Vietnam Airlines has been forced to wet lease aircraft at exorbitant rates. CAAV Director Dinh Viet Tung warned publicly of a serious shortage of aircraft, affecting transportation capacity on both domestic and international routes. Full resolution isn't expected until late 2026 or early 2027, perhaps even later. Domestic airfares surged 15 to 20% in early 2024 as seat availability plummeted. The very passengers whom low-cost carriers had democratized air travel for were suddenly priced out during peak periods. Yet, here's what's counterintuitive. Despite losing its fleet to engine groundings, Vietnam's airports still recorded record passenger numbers in 2025. International passengers reached 46.6 million, up 12% year-on-year, surpassing the 2019 pre-pandemic peak of 38 million. International cargo volumes surged 22.6% to 1.3 million tons. The market is growing faster than even mechanical crises can constrain it. Most Southeast Asian carriers cannot replicate what Vietnam has built. The conditions are structurally unique. Geography presents the first barrier. No other country in the region has Vietnam's elongated shape, creating a captive domestic corridor with no viable ground transportation alternative. Thailand's domestic market relies heavily on tourism to islands and resort destinations. Vietnam's domestic demand is fundamentally economic, driven by business travel and labor mobility between two massive urban centers. Demographics create the second advantage. Vietnam's population of nearly 100 million, with over 40% in peak earnings and traveling years, generates organic demand that smaller markets like Cambodia, Laos, or even Malaysia cannot match on a per capita basis. Regulatory protection forms the third moat. The 30% foreign ownership cap has prevented the entry of regional giants who would otherwise fragment the market. AirAsia's 2 decades of failed attempts demonstrate just how effective this barrier remains. Yet, every airline in Southeast Asia must now account for what Vietnam is demonstrating. Bangkok's Suvarnabhumi, which has historically dominated regional connectivity, faces a new competitor for transit traffic. Vietnamese carriers now operate 113 international routes. Vietjet's A330neo orders signal clear ambitions beyond Southeast Asia, targeting medium-haul routes to Australia, India, Central Asia, and eventually Europe. The assumption that Vietnam would remain a spoke in someone else's hub network is dissolving. Vietnamese carriers captured 40 to 45% of all international traffic in and out of their own country. Vietjet alone holds approximately 24% of the overall international market share. These airlines aren't feeding foreign hubs, they're building their own. Vietnam's aviation market represents the complete inversion. Not a network imposed from outside, but one built from within. not sustained by foreign carriers routing through foreign hubs, but powered by domestic airlines ordering hundreds of aircraft to serve a population that discovered flight was faster than the train and never looked back. When Long Tan International Airport opens its doors in 2026, it will anchor an aviation market that barely existed 15 years ago. The question isn't whether Vietnam's airlines can sustain this growth, it's whether the rest of Southeast Asia is really paying attention.